Two people can earn the exact same salary, save the exact same amount of money, and work equally hard for 20 years. Yet one of them can end up significantly wealthier than the other. Not because they found a secret investment, not because they started a business, not because they got lucky. The difference comes down to one concept that most people think they already understand but actually don't: inflation. Most people hear the word inflation and immediately think of rising prices, more expensive groceries, higher rent, bigger utility bills. But inflation is much more than that. Inflation quietly changes the rules of wealth building. It affects every dollar you earn, every dollar you save, and every financial decision you make. The strange part is that inflation rarely feels dangerous in the moment. It doesn't show up all at once. It doesn't send you a warning. It works slowly, quietly, and consistently. That's exactly why so many people underestimate it. Today, I want to show you why understanding inflation is one of the most important parts of understanding wealth. And to do that, let's look at two fictional people who seem almost identical on the surface. Meet Noah and Ethan. Both are 30 years old. Both earn approximately $60,000 per year. Both live in similar cities, have similar lifestyles, and save roughly the same percentage of their income. If you looked at their finances today, you would probably assume they'll end up in the same place 10 or 20 years from now. But there's one major difference. Noah thinks wealth is about accumulating money. Ethan thinks wealth is about preserving purchasing power. At first, that difference sounds small. In fact, it sounds almost meaningless. Money is money, right? If your bank account grows, you're getting wealthier. That's how most people think. That's certainly how Noah thinks. Every month, Noah transfers money into a savings account. He enjoys seeing the balance increase. When the account reaches $10,000, he feels accomplished. When it reaches $20,000, he feels even better. Every increase in the number gives him confidence that he's moving forward financially. Ethan saves too. He likes having money set aside. But whenever he sees a balance, he asks himself a different question. Not how much money do I have, but what will this money actually buy in the future? That single question changes everything. Number, the invisible leak. Imagine you own a bucket filled with water. Every month, you carefully pour more water into the bucket. You feel good because the water level keeps rising. But what if there's a tiny hole in the bottom? What if some water is slowly leaking out the entire time? That's how inflation works. Most people focus on the money they're adding. Very few people focus on the purchasing power they're losing. Let's imagine Noah saves $10,000 and leaves it untouched. 1 year passes, his account still shows $10,000. 2 years pass, the number is still there. 5 years pass, nothing appears to have changed. That's the trap. The number stayed the same, but the value didn't. If prices gradually rise over time, that same $10,000 buys fewer goods and services than it did before. The money hasn't disappeared, but some of its purchasing power has. And because the loss is invisible, most people never notice it happening. If someone physically removed money from Noah's account every month, he would be furious. He would immediately recognize the loss. But when purchasing power declines gradually, the loss feels abstract. It feels distant. And because it feels distant, it gets ignored. Human beings are surprisingly bad at understanding slow change. We're excellent at noticing sudden changes. If gasoline doubles in price overnight, everyone notices. If rent increases dramatically in a single month, everyone notices. But inflation rarely works that way. Most of the time, prices rise little by little, a few percent here, a small increase there, nothing that feels dramatic on its own. The problem is that our brains evaluate events individually instead of collectively. A slightly more expensive grocery bill doesn't seem important. A small rent increase doesn't seem catastrophic. A higher restaurant bill isn't the end of the world. But when these increases accumulate over years, the impact becomes enormous. Psychologists often refer to something called money illusion. Money illusion occurs when people focus on the face value of money rather than its purchasing power. In simple terms, people pay attention to the number itself instead of what the number can buy. That's why someone can feel richer simply because their salary increased, even if rising prices erased most of the benefit. It's also why people can save diligently for years while unknowingly losing purchasing power along the way. Noah isn't making a mistake because he's careless. He's making a mistake because his brain is doing what most human brains naturally do. It's focusing on the visible number. A few years pass. Noah feels good about his progress. His savings account continues growing. Every financial milestone feels like proof that his strategy is working. Then something strange happens. He starts noticing that life feels more expensive. His grocery bill is higher. Insurance costs more. Travel costs more. Dining out costs more. Even activities that once felt affordable now require more planning. At first, Noah blames individual companies. Maybe restaurants are greedy. Maybe insurance providers are charging too much. Maybe housing costs are unusually high. But Ethan sees something different. He recognizes a pattern. The issue isn't one product. The issue isn't one company. The issue is that money itself is changing. This is one of the most important ideas in economics. Yet it's rarely discussed in everyday conversations. Most people think of money as a fixed measuring stick. They assume a dollar today means the same thing as a dollar 10 years from now. But money isn't a fixed measuring stick. It's constantly changing. And once you understand that, you start seeing wealth differently. Here's a simple thought experiment. Imagine your favorite coffee costs $3 today. Now imagine checking that price 10 years from now. Will it still be exactly $3? Probably not. Maybe it's $4. Maybe it's $5. Maybe it's more. The exact number doesn't matter. What matters is understanding what happened. The coffee didn't become a completely different product. The ingredients didn't suddenly become 10 times better. What changed was the purchasing power of money. Now multiply that effect across every expense in your life: food, transportation, housing, healthcare, education, entertainment, utilities. The impact becomes much larger than most people expect. This is why inflation isn't really about prices. It's about purchasing power. Prices are simply the symptom. Purchasing power is the real story. And once you start focusing on purchasing power instead of account balances, you'll begin to understand why some people appear financially successful while quietly falling behind. Because wealth isn't measured by how much money you have. It's measured by what that money allows you to do. And inflation affects that calculation every single day, whether you notice it or not. At this point, Noah understands that inflation exists. Most people do. The problem isn't awareness. The problem is that inflation feels too small to matter. When people hear that prices are rising by a few percent per year, they usually shrug. 3% doesn't sound scary. 4% doesn't sound life-changing. Even 5% doesn't sound catastrophic. The human brain is naturally drawn to large numbers and dramatic events. Inflation is neither. It's slow, boring, and easy to ignore. But slow doesn't mean harmless. Imagine you're standing on a moving walkway at an airport. If the walkway is moving backward and you stand still, you'll gradually drift away from your destination. The movement feels almost invisible. You might not even notice it at first. But after enough time, you'll realize you've gone much farther backward than you expected. Inflation works in a similar way. If your money isn't growing while prices continue rising, you're effectively standing still on a walkway that's moving against you. This is where Noah starts to experience a problem he never anticipated. His savings account continues growing, but something feels off. Every year, he reaches a new savings milestone. Every year, he feels slightly less impressed by what those savings can actually do. The dream vacation he wanted now costs more than he expected. The car he planned to buy is more expensive than he remembered. The home prices in his area seem to move faster than his savings account. He can't quite explain why. On paper, everything looks fine. In reality, the finish line keeps moving. Around the same time, both Noah and Ethan receive raises at work. Their employers announce salary increases, and both men are excited. It feels like progress. After all, earning more money is usually a good thing. But Ethan immediately asks a question most people never ask. Compared to what? A raise sounds impressive until you compare it to rising costs. If someone's income rises by a certain amount while their expenses rise by a similar amount, the improvement may be smaller than it appears. This is one of the biggest reasons people feel confused about money. They earn more than they did 5 years ago. Their bank accounts are larger than they were 5 years ago. Yet financially, life doesn't feel dramatically easier. Many people assume they're doing something wrong. Sometimes they are, but sometimes they're simply experiencing the effects of inflation. The numbers got bigger, the purchasing power didn't improve as much as expected, and because most people focus on income instead of purchasing power, they struggle to understand what's happening. Noah sees his larger paycheck and feels wealthier. Ethan sees his larger paycheck and asks whether his purchasing power actually improved. One person focuses on the number, the other focuses on what the number can accomplish. That distinction becomes increasingly important over time. One of the strangest things about inflation is that it changes the value of time itself. Most people think of time as neutral. A year is a year. 5 years is 5 years. But financially, time can either work for you or against you. For Noah, time becomes a challenge. The longer money sits without increasing its purchasing power, the more inflation quietly chips away at its future value. Every year that passes creates a little more distance between today's prices and tomorrow's prices. Ethan views time differently. He understands that inflation compounds, but he also understands that many things in the financial world compound as well. He realizes that inflation isn't the only force working over long periods. Growth can compound, productivity can compound, skills can compound, businesses can compound, entire economies can compound. This realization changes how he thinks about wealth. Most people see inflation as a problem. Ethan sees it as a benchmark, a hurdle, a minimum standard that purchasing power must overcome. The goal isn't simply accumulating money. The goal is preserving and potentially increasing future purchasing power. That sounds like a small difference in wording. In reality, it's a completely different way of viewing wealth. Let's imagine a strange scenario. Suppose you wake up tomorrow and discover that every dollar in the world has doubled. Your salary doubles. Your bank account doubles. Everyone else's money doubles too. At first, that sounds amazing. People would celebrate. They would feel richer instantly. But would anyone actually be wealthier? Not necessarily. If prices eventually adjusted upward as well, purchasing power might remain largely unchanged. This example reveals something important. Money itself isn't wealth. Money is a tool for accessing wealth. Wealth is the collection of goods, services, experiences, opportunities, and security that money can provide. This distinction sounds simple, but it's incredibly important. People spend years chasing larger numbers without asking whether those numbers represent greater purchasing power. Noah slowly begins to understand this. The realization is uncomfortable because it forces him to question assumptions he's held for years. He always believed that saving money automatically meant becoming wealthier. Now he's learning that the relationship is more complicated. Saving money is important, but understanding purchasing power is equally important. Without that understanding, people can accidentally confuse larger balances with greater wealth. Here's another way to think about inflation. Most people believe they're competing against other people. In reality, they're also competing against time. Every year, prices change. Markets change. Technology changes. Entire industries change. The purchasing power required to maintain a certain lifestyle changes. Inflation is simply one expression of that reality. And because it's always present in some form, it becomes the background force shaping every long-term financial decision. This is why wealthy people often think differently about money. They aren't necessarily obsessed with accumulating dollars. They're focused on preserving future options. They're thinking about what their resources will be able to accomplish years from now. Noah spent years measuring success by account balances. Ethan spent years measuring success by future capability. At first, the difference was invisible. Now it's becoming obvious. One evening, Noah and Ethan meet for dinner. As they talk, the conversation turns toward money. Noah proudly mentions how much he has saved over the years. Ethan congratulates him. Saving consistently is an achievement worth celebrating. But then Ethan asks a question. If prices keep rising over the next decade, what do you think those savings will actually buy? Noah pauses. It's a simple question, yet he doesn't have a simple answer. For years, he focused on how much money he was accumulating. He rarely stopped to think about what that money might be worth in the future. That moment becomes a turning point, not because Noah suddenly changes everything, not because he discovers a magical financial strategy, but because he starts asking better questions, and better questions often lead to better decisions. The biggest lesson isn't that inflation is scary. The biggest lesson is that wealth is more complicated than most people realize. Money is only part of the equation. Purchasing power is the other part. And once you understand that, you begin to see financial decisions through a completely different lens. At this point, Noah understands something he never fully appreciated before. Inflation isn't just a news headline. It's not simply a discussion for economists or central bankers. It's a force that quietly shapes nearly every financial outcome over long periods of time. But there's an even deeper lesson hiding underneath all of this. Most people believe wealth is built by earning more money. That's only partially true. Income matters, saving matters, discipline matters. But wealth is ultimately determined by the gap between what you have and what your future costs will be. And inflation constantly influences that gap. Imagine two people standing on opposite sides of a river. One person moves forward by 3 steps every year. The other side of the river moves away by 2 steps every year. Technically, the person is making progress, but they're moving much slower than they think. That's how many people experience money. They work harder, they get raises, they save more, yet the financial freedom they imagined always seems slightly out of reach. The reason isn't always poor decisions. Sometimes it's because they're measuring movement instead of distance. Inflation quietly changes the distance. One thing that often surprises people is that wealthy individuals don't necessarily think more about money. In many cases, they think more about purchasing power. When most people receive extra income, they immediately think about the amount itself. How much bigger is the paycheck? How much larger is the bonus? How much money is sitting in the account? People who understand inflation tend to ask a different question. What will this be worth in the future? That question sounds simple, but it changes behavior. It shifts attention away from short-term appearances and toward long-term outcomes. For example, imagine 2 neighbors. One proudly tells everyone that they have $100,000 sitting in an account. The other rarely talks about money at all. On the surface, the first person appears more financially aware. But if the second person spends more time thinking about future purchasing power, long-term planning, and maintaining financial flexibility, they may actually have a much deeper understanding of wealth. The difference isn't intelligence, it's perspective. One person sees money as a number. The other sees money as future choices. And wealth is really about choices. The ability to choose where you live. The ability to choose how you spend your time. The ability to handle unexpected problems. The ability to pursue opportunities when they appear. Purchasing power influences all of those things. There's another reason inflation is so important. It exposes a hidden weakness in human psychology. As people earn more, they often spend more. A larger apartment, a newer car, more subscriptions, more dining out, more vacations. None of these things are inherently bad. The problem occurs when expenses rise as quickly as income. Many people spend years chasing higher salaries without realizing their lifestyle is expanding at the same speed. From the outside, they appear successful. Inside, they feel stuck. This creates a strange situation. Someone earning twice as much as they did 10 years ago may not feel twice as wealthy. In fact, they may not feel wealthier at all. Part of that comes from inflation. Part of it comes from lifestyle inflation. Together, they create a powerful combination. One force makes things more expensive, the other encourages people to spend more, and both quietly reduce future financial flexibility. Noah eventually realizes that inflation isn't the only challenge. The real challenge is understanding how inflation interacts with human behavior, because money decisions are rarely mathematical, they're psychological. Now, it's important to keep this conversation balanced. Sometimes people hear discussions about inflation and assume every dollar should constantly be working toward growth. That's not realistic. Cash still serves important purposes. Emergency funds matter. Unexpected expenses happen. Job losses happen. Medical emergencies happen. Life rarely follows a perfect plan. Having accessible money available can provide stability and peace of mind. That's valuable. Inflation awareness shouldn't turn into panic. It shouldn't create fear. And it shouldn't lead people to believe that every dollar must be optimized at all times. The goal isn't perfection. The goal is understanding. Understanding what inflation does. Understanding how purchasing power changes over time. Understanding the strengths and limitations of different financial choices. Once you understand those things, you can make more informed decisions. Years later, Noah looks back at how he once thought about money. He remembers checking his account balance constantly. He remembers feeling proud whenever the number increased. And he remembers assuming that a larger number automatically meant greater wealth. Now he sees things differently. Whenever he evaluates a financial decision, he asks himself a question. What does this mean for my future purchasing power? It's a simple question, but it completely changes how he views wealth. Suddenly, financial decisions become less about appearances and more about outcomes. Less about today, more about tomorrow. Less about numbers, more about capability. And that's ultimately what wealth is. Capability, the ability to use resources to create security, freedom, opportunity, and peace of mind. Money is simply the tool. Purchasing power determines how effective that tool actually is. Let's go back to where we started. Noah and Ethan earned similar incomes. They saved similar amounts. They worked equally hard. The difference wasn't effort. The difference wasn't talent. The difference wasn't luck. The difference was understanding. Noah spent years focusing on how much money he had. Ethan spent years focusing on what that money could do. At first, those ideas seemed identical. Over time, they proved to be very different. Because wealth isn't a stack of currencies sitting in an account. Wealth is the ability to maintain and expand your options over time. It's the ability to weather uncertainty. It's the ability to create flexibility. It's the ability to make choices without being controlled by financial pressure. And inflation influences every one of those things. That's why inflation matters so much. Not because prices go up. Not because economists talk about it. Not because it's constantly mentioned in financial news. It matters because it quietly affects the relationship between money and reality. Most people spend their lives counting dollars. Very few spend time measuring purchasing power. But purchasing power is what determines whether your money can actually support the life you want. The number in your account is only a symbol. What that number can buy is what truly matters. And once you understand that distinction, you'll never look at money the same way again. Because if you don't understand inflation, you don't understand wealth.